guys, the Comics Kid 2099 here. Last week I talked about the 1989 pilot for Pride of the X-Men, which was a failed attempt to get the X-Men into animation. 3 years later, we got Night of the Sentinels, which was a two-part series premiere of X-Men the Animated Series. It was just called X-Men, but we know it as X-Men the Animated Series. This is a series that lasted for 5 years, and so I imagine for a lot of people it was their entrance into the X-Men. This is definitely how I came to be aware of the X-Men. I didn't watch it a ton when I was a kid, but it was definitely present enough in my life that I knew most of the characters. Some of them I might not have known by name, but I at least visually, if you showed me a picture, I could say, yeah, that's one of the X-Men. I had a lot of the toys when I was growing up. Not a lot, but I had several. I remember having these, there was a Cyclops figure and a Wolverine figure about that tall, and it was like a Viewmaster, sort of. Like you could look inside the figure somehow, and it would show you screenshots from the episodes. Kind of a weak toy, I guess. It didn't have any mobility or anything, but I remember thinking that was the coolest thing ever when I was in kindergarten. I was really young when this series started, but I was just at that prime age where I was just perfect to be getting into superheroes, and this was a really great time for superheroes. Batman the Animated Series was starting around the same time. I don't remember when Spider-Man the Animated Series started. I feel like it might have been just a little bit after X-Men the Animated Series. There was a little bit of overlap there, but I don't think they both started at the same time. But I was a huge fan of both of those, or all three of those. There were a bunch of superhero cartoons in the 90s that I didn't even know about until many years later, like the Fantastic Four, Savage Dragon, Wildcats. They all had cartoons that I did not know about at the time, but X-Men was a huge one. I would say, even though now I enjoy Batman the Animated Series much more than X-Men, I would say, in terms of popularity at the time, X-Men probably edged out Batman a little bit. Although, I could be wrong, because I wasn't really old enough to know about that kind of thing back then, but Batman was coming off of the 1989 movie, so it definitely had more of a boost. Maybe it was more well-loved. I don't know. But anyway, this is a two-part episode, and my rules here are going to be very similar to whenever I have done reviews of animated superhero cartoons on Saturdays. If it's a multi-part storyline, I will talk about all the episodes that are in a saga, if you will. So if it's a three-part story, I'll talk about all three episodes at once. So we have the two-part Night of the Sentinels here, kicking off X-Men the Animated Series. This is created by Margaret Loesch. I've never heard of her before, and I'm curious if she just kind of slapped her name on it and helped get this thing off the ground, but didn't really have anything to do with creating the series. Because you have things like, say, Batman Forever. Tim Burton is listed as a producer on Batman Forever, but if you watch that movie, and if you're familiar with Burton's filmography, you can pretty safely say, yeah, he didn't really have anything to do with making that. He just put his name on it and let Joel Schumacher and everyone else do their thing. And I'm wondering if that is the case with Margaret Loesch, because you look on the Internet Movie Database, and she is listed for several episodes as the creator of the series, but I don't see her listed as like a producer or a writer or showrunner or anything like that that would denote a little bit more involvement in the creation process. Then you have written by Mark Edward Edens. He wrote both parts. Story consultation by Bob Harris, who is an editor at Marvel Comics at the time. This is something that you got to see Batman the Animated Series do this a little bit, where they would take people who had actually written comic book storylines and have them write episodes of their series, because why not? If you want to get this right, if you want to take a franchise or a character from the comics and adapt them in some way into another media, why not go to the source material? Why not go to a place where people are more familiar with those characters? I'm not saying that someone like Mark Edward Edens wasn't familiar with the X-Men, but I've never heard of him, so maybe he wasn't. Maybe he was more of a TV person, and he didn't really know much about comics, so let's get somebody who has worked at Marvel Comics and get them to kind of help us steer this thing in the right direction. The choice of Bob Harris is a little bit weird, because I know him as an editor at Marvel, but if you ask me any of the major series or stories that he has had a hand in editing, I wouldn't be able to tell you. I just know that he worked at Marvel Comics. So Chris Claremont at this time, he had just come off of a 16-year run on the X-Men. He left the series in the comics in 1991. This animated episode starts in 1992, so they probably weren't going to be able to get him to come in and help. He was probably still a little miffed about how things ended with him leaving the comics. And then Jim Lee at this time was probably getting ready to go and co-found Image Comics with with Todd McFarlane and Eric Larson, Rob Liefeld, Mark Silvestri, all those guys. I hope I'm not missing anyone. I don't think that I am. I'm sure there's someone else there that's going to be huge that I can't remember. But anyway, so all those, Willis Portacio, maybe? I don't know. But anyway, so Jim Lee was probably still working on the X-Men in 1992, but he was probably getting ready to leave. So they probably weren't going to be able to get him to come in to be a story consultant either. So they got Bob Harris. Maybe not the third person that I would have thought of to do a story consult on this. I mean, you had someone like Louise Simonson who had written X Factor for a good chunk of the 1980s. So I think maybe you could have gotten someone who had more of a hand in guiding the X-Men in the previous decade other than someone like Bob Harris. He worked at Marvel. That seems to be his only credit that they had to his name. Like, okay, this guy knows the X-Men. Let's get him in here to consult on this. And I don't know how much of this was him saying, you guys should do this. This is something that's really huge right now. This series is pretty big because the costumes, all the character designs are pretty much taken right off the page from what was going on at this time. Just about all of these characters look exactly like how Jim Lee kind of retooled them a couple years earlier. And Jim Lee had been illustrating the X-Men in the late 80s. It was either 88 or 89 when he first started drawing X-Men, but pretty much everyone knows his run on the X-Men from whenever a second X-Men series started, X-Men issue 1 in 1991. And that is where the new costumes came about. Wolverine went from the brown costume that he had throughout most of the 1980s back to his yellow costume. That's what we get to see here. You have Professor X in the hover chair. That was kind of a thing around this time. So all these character designs are very concurrent with the X-Men comics that were coming out at this time. And that's something that is a little surprising to me because a lot of comic book fans, they're going to be huge fans of the previous 10 years of X-Men stories. They all, I would say, were very huge fans of Chris Claremont and John Byrne's run that included Dark Phoenix Saga and Days of Future Past. They probably liked the stuff that came before that, too, with Dave Cockrum. So even though that stuff had happened about 10 years earlier, I'm kind of surprised that they didn't go to the well there. I am a little surprised that they were kind of going for a synergy thing here where, okay, the Jim Lee stuff is really hot right now in comic book stores, so we're going to use that material in this cartoon. Because their target demographic, I don't think, was teenagers and adults who were very familiar with the Jim Lee stuff in the comics. I would say their target demographic was people who were in kindergarten, like I was, who didn't even know how to read yet, but they could say, hey, that's Wolverine, that's Professor X. So it's a little odd that they went for that design, but maybe their target demographic was a little older. Maybe it was kind of like a Batman the Animated Series where they were going for something that people who were older could enjoy, but also it was geared towards younger people as well. So I'm not really sure, but it worked out okay, and it's not a huge deal breaker or anything for me. But I was thinking if I was in their shoes, if it was me making this series in 1991, 1992, I might have gone for a look that was a little bit more timeless. Go for the costumes that they were wearing during the Dark Phoenix saga. And then you could always kind of use the characters who were showing up in the comics at that time. Gambit was still a very new character in the comics at this time. Jubilee had been around for a few more years than Gambit. Use those characters, but maybe use some other designs. I don't know. It's just something that was a little odd to me. Like I say, I don't hate it, but it's something that when you're doing an adaptation and then you start pulling from something that's going on right now, it makes me think, well, what about all this other stuff? You have 30 years of stuff here, and they were never going to use anything from the Silver Age, so let's say they had 20 years of stuff there that they could have used. I always find it a little odd whenever they just ignore all of that. Now, later on in the series, they will be poaching some of the stories that came from earlier, like the Dark Phoenix saga. We will get to see more of that later on, but as far as designs, they were going for a very new look. So I find that to be a little interesting. Also, this was developed by Eric Lewald and Sidney Iwanter and Mark Edward Edens. I have never heard of any of these names, and much like how Margaret Loesch was credited as the creator of the series, I don't know how much was actually done by someone who helped develop the series. I don't know if they were doing a lot of the legwork before it got started. For example, we're trying to make a deal here with Fox, like, hey, we've got this X-Men thing. I know that a couple years ago there was Pride of the X-Men. This is going to be a little bit different. I don't know who these people are. These are not names that I'm very familiar with, so I don't know if they were about as involved as Margaret Loesch, or if they actually had more of a hand in creating this series. Because in the early 90s, superheroes were not a big thing. You had Batman, and then in the 80s you had the Superman movies, but most of those were not very well loved by people. Batman was a huge sales juggernaut, but at that time that was one movie. So I imagine it still took a lot of convincing for the people who were making these cartoons to say, hey, this is something you're going to want to get on. So I'm not saying that these people, the developers or the creator of the series, I'm not saying that they didn't do anything, but I am curious how much of a hand they had in the actual story. Did they have any hand in, okay, you're going to use Sentinels, you're going to use Mr. Gyrick, you're going to use Robert Kelly, these are the X-Men you're going to use. I don't know how much of a hand they had there. But anyway, so this story is a two-parter where you have the Mutant Registration Act. That was a thing that we saw in the comics a little bit, going as far back as the Days of Future Past storyline, which had stuff in the present day and then stuff about 20 or so, 20, 30 years in the future. And in the future timeline, we are told that the Mutant Registration Act was a big thing that kind of led to that future. Well, here we have it. It's already in full swing, and Jubilee, she's been having some problems at home. She was recently adopted, and her foster dad or her adopted dad, he signs her up for the Mutant Registration Act, not because he's evil or mean-spirited. You look at like the second X-Men movie, and Iceman's parents, they are a little bit more mean-spirited than Jubilee's parents are here. They don't really get that Bobby is a mutant and that he can't control it. They're kind of okay to just let him go his own way and never come back home. That's not how it is here with Jubilee's parents. I really like that even though he does sign her up for the Mutant Registration Act, he doesn't understand that that's a bad thing. He thinks that they are going to help Jubilee. And then later, when Cyclops comes and is trying to explain, hey, there's some bad stuff going on here, the dad is saying, okay, you got to get out of here because there's a big giant robot that's going to come and kill you. So I really like that this guy is misguided, but he's not evil. I like that. That's very good, very subtle. It's not something that I necessarily would have expected from the series, because I've said before that this is a series I have a love-hate relationship with. There are a lot of things about it that I really like. It got me into the X-Men, and if it wasn't for this series, I don't know if Lawrence Schuer Donner would have been able to have convinced Bryan Singer to make the X-Men movies that he made in the early 2000s, and then that was really what got me into the comics. So I don't know if I would even be reading comic books if it wasn't for this series, but looking back on it now, I have tried multiple times to rewatch this series, and it's difficult. There's a lot here that is really silly, a lot of stuff that doesn't hold up to what I remember it being, but then there's some stuff here that's really good. I like the tragedy of Jubilee here, where she feels like she's alone in the world, and she says, you know, I didn't ask to be a mutant. That's some pretty heavy stuff for a Saturday morning cartoon, so I really like that. You've got the X-Men, they are hanging out at the mall. This worked a little bit better in the comics, I think, because the X-Women, Storm, Rogue, Dazzler, and Psylocke, they were at the mall when they first met Jubilee in the late 80s. So they kind of have the same method of introducing Jubilee to the X-Men, but here it almost feels like, yeah, the X-Men just decided to go and hang out at the mall. And Rogue, she's young and hip. I could see her going to the mall. Gambit, he's a weirdo. I don't really know. I guess he just goes to the mall to buy cards. I guess that's where all of his playing cards come from. Storm, I have no idea why she would want to go to the mall. Storm is my favorite X-Man, but I don't see her just wanting to go to the mall and hanging out, so that was a little strange. But Jubilee's there playing the arcade, and the Sentinel goes to her house because she has been signed up in the Mutant Registration Act, and we find out later that Mr. Gyrick, he is actually wanting to do experiments on the mutants to try and figure out this whole mutant hunting robot system that he's got going on, and he picked Jubilee's name out of a hat, but she had already run away from home by that point. And so somehow the Sentinel knows to go to the mall. I don't really understand how he knows that unless he just, well, she's a teenager. She's going to be at the mall. So that was a little silly. But the Sentinel's there doing a lot more damage than any mutant has ever done. We do see on a news broadcast at the beginning of this episode that Sabretooth is like throwing cars around somewhere. And we will be seeing a lot more of him later on. But we don't really know why he does what he does. We don't know if this is the kind of Sabretooth that we will see later on in the first X-Men movie, who is subservient to someone else, or if he kind of has his own very sick and twisted agenda that involves throwing police cars towards a camera in a newscopter. But we do get to see that mutants are doing some damage, kind of making a name for themselves in the news, and that is kind of what prompts Senator Kelly to kind of be doing his little speeches on TV. He's not allied with Mr. Gyrick. Now, Gyrick is a character from the comics. He was kind of involved with Storm losing her powers in the 1980s for a little while, but he's also just as much of an Avengers character as he is an X-Men character. I would say even a little bit more of an Avengers character. So he's not someone that I am super well knowledgeable about. I don't know just a ton about him, other than he's one of the government types who thinks that mutants are a threat and they need to be taken down. He's just kind of a generic government face. I don't really know much about him as a character like I do some of the other X-Men threats that we will see later on in the series. But Professor X finds out that the Sentinel attacked Jubilee because it was somehow involved with the Mutant Registration Act, so he sends the X-Men to go and secretly destroy all the files at the Mutant Registration Act home base, and this is something that definitely wouldn't work in this day and age, because those files would be networked. They'd be in hundreds of bases all over the world, and so going to one base and destroying all the files that they have wouldn't really work, but it works fine in 1992. So a team of X-Men go to destroy those files. Meanwhile, Jubilee, who is rescued from the mall and brought to the X-Mansion where she gets to speech, this is a school for people like you. You can stay here and learn to hone your powers, that sort of thing. Storm is the one who actually gives her the speech, which I did find to be a little bit odd. I was kind of expecting it to come from Professor X, but anyway, Jubilee runs away from the X-Mansion just about as soon as she can. I guess even though they say that they are on her side, she's still a little bit scared. She really doesn't know if she can trust these people, so she runs away and then gets captured by the Sentinel again, or this time it does capture her, brings her to the base, and so the X-Men happen to be getting there at the same time, and then they do get away after they successfully destroy all of the files, but Beast is captured, and Morph, who is a character you may have never heard of before if you read the comics, he is killed, seemingly. Now, they play with this a little bit. They don't actually get to show they don't show us Morph dying, but they do say in dialogue, yeah, he's dead. And Morph is a character who, like I said, up until this point wasn't really part of the X-Men. If you read some of the late 1960s stuff, there was a villain who worked with Factor 3 called Changeling, and then later on they killed Professor X as kind of a gimmick to try and get people to check in on a comic, and then later still they said, no, just kidding, Professor X was hiding in the basement, Changeling was pretending to be Professor X, so that guy who died, that was actually Changeling. And eventually, in the Age of Apocalypse comics, Changeling is still alive in that universe, even though it was cancer or something that he had, which caused him to go to Professor X to say, hey, I want to balance out my life. Apparently in the Age of Apocalypse he didn't have cancer, I guess, but that is the character. Changeling slash Morph from the Age of Apocalypse is here. Again, this is a weird cyclical thing where if they hadn't used him here, I doubt that they would have ever used him in the Age of Apocalypse, and then his popularity there is what caused him to bring a more or less identical character from not the Age of Apocalypse into the Exile series that started in the early 2000s. And so, if you're familiar with Morph from the last 20 years, you have this series to thank for that, because before this, we hadn't even seen him in any way since like 1967 or something like that. But anyway, Morph is basically just here to be cannon fodder. We need someone to die so that we can see that the stakes are high, and Beast does get captured, and that does raise the stakes, but someone actually dying makes it even worse. And they couldn't kill someone who was an actual character who had been around in the comics, so they bring in Morph. I guess maybe they didn't want to bring in Thunderbird because maybe they figured that was racially insensitive. His costume, his attitude, his speech, a lot of that was just really not well written in 1975 in Giant Size X-Men, and then later when he was killed off in X-Men issue 94, I think. But maybe they just figured, hey, we don't want to kill like one of the only people of color in the series, so let's bring in Morph. Now you might be saying that he looks Asian. He does look Asian, but in the comics he's not, so I don't know if this version is Asian, and if he is, then that completely throws out my theory about them wanting to kill someone off who's not a person of color, a minority, because if they did that, that might seem a little like, oh, the black guy dies first, that kind of thing. So if he is Asian, then that just completely runs over my theory there. But they bring in Morph here, they have him as an X-Man, basically so that they can have someone to kill, and that will come up later on in the series. Morph eventually does come back, where they say, hey, just kidding, he wasn't really dead. In this episode, though, you have Jean Grey and Professor X, who both put on Cerebro, and they're like, oh no, I can't hear Morph. And then later on, the X-Men get back to the school, and then one of them, I think Cyclops says, Beast got captured, and Morph, well, he didn't get captured. And so it's very heavily hinting that Morph is actually dead here. So it's a little odd that they do try to bring him back, but by the time they did, I think that was when the Age of Apocalypse was kind of getting started. So maybe they were again trying to do this synergy thing. I don't know. But anyway, the episode ends with Beast. He is captured by the organization here, and then Wolverine, he's mad at Cyclops because in his mind, Cyclops actually is responsible for Morph dying. And then basically, you got the status quo of the X-Men kind of set up here, where they are feared and hated by a world they are sworn to protect. At one point, I don't know if it was Cyclops or someone else, but they said, so this Mutant Registration Act, is it the government?
No. The Mutant Control Agency is a private organization, occasionally supported by the government.
So, to me, later on in the episode, Mr. Gyrich, I don't know how to pronounce his name. In the first X-Men movie, they pronounce it Gyrich, but I think that may not be how it's pronounced here. But anyway, at one point, he gets a direct order from the President of the United States, who is a woman. That's very progressive. I like that. And she says, you are not to do any more hunting out mutants anymore. So, it makes it seem like they are pretty closely affiliated with the government, which is weird because Professor X says no, they're not. And I don't know if that was this animated series saying we don't want to teach our little kids that the government is bad and that they are going out there hunting their favorite superheroes. So we want to say that these guys are part of a separate organization that doesn't have anything to do with the government, except you've also got the President of the United States handing out orders that they need to cease and desist. So that was a little strange, I thought. But anyway, I think it would have been cool if you could have had some of the X-Men maybe argue with Professor X a little bit and say, no, we're pretty sure these guys are government. They've got some pretty deep pockets here that are able to pay for these gigantic, 30-foot tall robots. Who else will be paying for that but the government? And then we do see that the government is saying, no, don't do this anymore. So that was a little bit odd. If we could have had a little bit more friction between Cyclops and Professor X, where Professor X is like, no, we do not need to become enemies of the government. Things are already pretty dicey as is. We don't want to go against the government flat out. We're just going to secretly do this. And then Cyclops says, look, whether you like it or not, the government is trying to hunt us down. I think that would have been cool. We do get a little bit of friction between the two of them. At one point, Wolverine is kind of egging on Cyclops, saying, ooh, teacher's pet, he's getting cold feet because of this mission. But I wish they had played with that a little bit more. Speaking of Cyclops, he's a character I don't usually like, but I do like him here. He is very clearly, he feels guilty. Nobody feels worse about Morph's death than Cyclops does. But at the same time, whenever he goes and seeks out Wolverine later, Wolverine says, are you here to apologize about that? And he says, I don't apologize for command decisions. I like that. He is clearly the guy who, if Professor X dies, he's going to be the one that steps up and kind of takes over the dream, but he also doesn't feel as committed to it. As we see, he kind of talks back to Professor X a little bit when he's saying, look, are you sure this is a good idea? I really like that a lot. I hope that the series can play with him a little bit more, and he doesn't just become Jean Grey's boyfriend, which is often the role that he's delegated to whenever you have stories like this. So anyway, I don't really know what else to say. Let's go ahead and talk about the elephant in the room, the accents. Whenever you're reading an X-Men comic, it's really easy to overlook the silly accents. Wolverine will say the word bub, and he doesn't really have a stereotypical Canadian accent, but if Banshee was here, you know that he would just have a really stereotypical Scottish accent, or Irish. Oh wow, I hope I didn't offend anyone. I think he is Irish, Maury McTaggart is Scottish. Anyway, but you know he would have a very stereotypical accent that when you're reading the comic, it doesn't jump out at you as much. Occasionally there'll be like a, oh, boyo, top of the morning to you, something like that. They'll throw that in there every now and then, but for the most part, you can read it and it's not getting in the way of you enjoying the story. But if it's in a non-print medium, a comic book, or that's a print medium, wow, a cartoon, a radio series, if they did an X-Men radio series, or a movie, then they're going to have to tone the accents down a little bit because it's going to get in the way of you enjoying it. It's going to be laughable, I think. So Storm here, she doesn't so much have an African accent wherever she's supposed to be from. I don't think they ever really said where she was from in the comics, but she doesn't really have an accent, but she does kind of talk in a very stilted voice where she'll say, Storm, mistress of the elements commands you, and it's very silly dialogue. Rogue does have a very goofy accent. I am from the South. I'm I'm from Tennessee, and I don't know very many people who talk like Rogue does, where Suga doesn't even have an R in it. I don't know most people who talk like that. Gambit has a very goofy accent, and it's laughably bad, but at the same time, I'm enjoying it. I'm laughing at the series, but I'm not having a bad time laughing at it, if that makes any sense. But anyway, that's something that it's going to take a little while for me to get used to here, but it was something I figured I'd go ahead and bring up. As you can see, I'm wearing a Magneto shirt here. You can't tell, but it says Magneto was right. This is from the Grant Morrison New X-Men run. I'm wearing this because Magneto was right. The American government is sending out giant robots to attack and detain mutants and possibly kill them. So he definitely wasn't wrong. There's a lot of horrible stuff going on here that Magneto is fighting against and has been warning Charles against in the comics for years. So, wow, Magneto was right, like I said. So anyway, that's about all that I have to say about Night of the Sentinels. We will be talking about another episode probably next week. So until then, I hope that you guys enjoyed this two-part episode and enjoyed my review of it. In the meantime, you guys have a great rest of the day. Catch you later.